This is Ben May, and I want to thank you for joining us as we continue to seek the old past. In Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16, God through the prophet Jeremiah is imploring and pleading with His people to seek the old past. He said, "Stand in the way and see, and ask for the old past, where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls." But they said, "We will not walk in it." And so we are calling people back to the old past. I tell you can't get much older than the past we have been studying in the book of Genesis. I hope that the study has been enjoyable, but not just enjoyable. I hope that it has been profitable. And I hope that we see in the lesson that we will look at this time, how that God always does exactly what He says He will do. Now often, He will say what He's going to do hundreds of years before it ever happens. And to me, that's just amazing. But it shows who God is. The God that we serve, the God of heaven, is He who the Bible says knows the end from the beginning. And we're going to see that now as we look at the story in particular of the end days of Jacob. Remember last time we ended up talking about that just heart-wrenching and heart-stirring story of Joseph. And just to give a little bit of a quick update, remember that Joseph's 10 brothers sold him into slavery. But God was with Joseph every single step of the way. In fact, he ended up being the governor of all Egypt, really second only to Pharaoh. His own brothers, the ones who sold him into slavery, they come to buy grain because there was a severe famine in the land that also affected the land of Canaan. So Joseph's brothers come. And they need to buy grain as everyone else was needing to buy grain from Egypt. But they didn't know it was Joseph. And Joseph really put them through the test to see what kind of men they had become. It had been 22 years since they had seen each other. And so as a teenager, now as a mature man, they just didn't know it. But then the scripture says he just couldn't restrain himself any longer. And so we looked at in Genesis chapter 45. In verse 1, "Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, 'Make everyone go out from me.' And he reveals himself to his brothers." And can you just imagine the look on their faces when he says to them, "I am Joseph"? Well, they were so stunned that they hardly wanted to speak to him. They didn't know what to say. Here, the man that literally held their life in his hands, and they sold him into slavery, in fact, wanted to kill him. And so we find in Genesis 45, and this is where we ended up, in verse 4, he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." It was quite a reunion. So, what happens next? Well, remember, God had let Pharaoh know through 2 dreams that there was going to be 7 years of great plenty. All the harvest and all that would be such as they'd never seen. Followed by 7 years of the worst famine they had ever seen. And they were only 2 years into the famine. So Joseph knew there are 5 more years of this terrible famine, and he wants to bring his family to him. And so he sends his brothers now to bring their father to Egypt. And so you can imagine the anticipation of Joseph. He says in verse 9 of Genesis 45, "Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have, there I will provide for you. Lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine." And so he sends them. And he just loads them up with everything. He kissed his brothers. He wept over them in verse 15. He talked with them for a long time. Pharaoh hears about this, and Pharaoh's glad about this. He says, "You go get your family. You bring them to Egypt." And now you listen to me in verse 19. You are commanded to do this. Take carts and so forth. And he sends them with all that's needed to bring Jacob and his family back to Egypt. And he gave all of them changes of garments, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. Remember, Benjamin is his only full brother. And so he sent all of these good things of Egypt to his father Jacob. Now, imagine now, these brothers, they've got to come and tell their father that Joseph is alive. Now, they never told their father what they did. They never confessed to their father, and we have no record that they ever do. But we do have indication that at least they have learned a valuable lesson. And so they come, and notice verse 26 of Genesis 45. And they told him, saying, Joseph is still alive. Now imagine a father that has grieved for years, 22 years, for his son. He is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. Now, if you have children, imagine hearing that. Thinking your child is dead, and now he's alive. And not only is he alive, he is the governor over all of Egypt. What would you think? Notice, and Jacob's heart stood still because he did not believe them. Just imagine. Well, what convinces him? Well, notice it says, but when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. Then Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Can you just imagine the father's joy and knowing such a thing, and knowing that his family is going to be taken care of? And so Jacob and his family, they get ready now to go back, not go back, but to go to Egypt. I appreciate what is inserted here now in chapter 46. What does Jacob do in verse 1? He goes and he worships God, offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. So he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. It just gives me chills to think about what must be going on with Jacob. But let me say this. God speaks, doesn't he, through this means to Jacob. And he says to Jacob, Joseph will put his hands on your eyes. You'll see him. It's been 22 years. Do you suppose, or why do you suppose, let me say it this way, that God waited all this time to let Jacob know that this son that he had undoubtedly poured out his heart to God about was still alive? He says, Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Sometimes I think we can become discouraged and we can think, well, surely God doesn't care, or God doesn't hear my prayer. Why doesn't God do then whatever it is that we think God ought to be doing? And maybe Jacob might have been thinking similar things. Well, why doesn't God let me know? Why didn't God protect my son? Why is it God has allowed my son to have this terrible fate of an animal killing him? That's what he thought. Joseph answered, he said, God sent me here before you to preserve life. See, we don't know what God is planning. We don't know what is unfolding that we have no clue about. But God knows. And so God chose not to tell Jacob, though he was deep in grief, he chose not to tell Jacob that Joseph was still alive. See, God had a bigger plan. And we'll see it unfolding even as we continue now with our story. Now, Jacob and all his family traveled down to Egypt, and there were about 70 people that are coming. Now the number varies according to which account you read. Some, it seems, includes Joseph in the number and his family, and some do not, and so on. But there were about, in round numbers, about 70 people as we look at chapter 46 and verse 27. And that's important because when we get to our next study, as we study in the book of Exodus and beyond, we find that they have indeed grown to be a mighty nation of over 1 million people. But here are these 70 people moving into the land of Goshen. Pharaoh welcomes them with open arms and says, this is the best of the land of Egypt. Now you just take this and you live here. And we find then that Jacob's family is going to grow. And they're going to be multiplying. It says in chapter 47 and verse 27. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there and grew and multiplied exceedingly. You imagine the grand reunion, though, when Jacob gets there and there's Joseph, and they hugged and they wept and they kissed each other, and for a long time. What a grand reunion that was. Jacob is going to go and he's going to see Pharaoh. And he's going to bless Pharaoh. And it's interesting to me that Pharaoh asked Jacob how old he is. Well, he was 130 at the time. And that seemed to be a very interesting thing to Pharaoh. But now, Jacob is going to live 17 years in Egypt. He'll be 147 when he dies. As he approached his death, he asked Joseph now, he says, he's making his arrangements. He says, Joseph, don't bury me here in Egypt. You promise me, swear to me, that you'll take me back and bury me with my family, with my people. And so he'll take him back to Hebron and bury him in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Isaac are buried. And so now in chapter 48, we find that he first is going to talk with Joseph, and Joseph is going to have his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. And he's going to proceed now to bless each of his sons. In chapter 49, though, in verse 1, and Jacob called his sons and said, gather together, that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days. Now, when Jacob said that, he said a lot, because he really is going to tell them things that will not happen for hundreds of years. But Jacob, right here at the end of Genesis, is going to tell what's going to happen all the way to at least the beginning, and could argue even beyond, of the New Testament. I want to show you now, share with you a timeline. And hopefully you can see this okay. Notice now that as you notice this, notice that you've got Joseph in the right sort of the center, the top upper part of this chart. There's Joseph. And this timeline, you notice directly below that it says 2000 BC, and Joseph is a little to the right of that. And so around 1850 to 1875 BC would be the time of Joseph. And this would be around the time now that Jacob is telling his sons what is going to happen in the days to come. Now, notice also in this timeline, this is interesting to me, notice the very bottom line here of the people. It says Shem. Notice Shem. You notice, now remember who Shem is. Noah, you say Noah? That's right, way back in Genesis chapter 6 and the flood. Remember studying that. Noah had 3 sons. The oldest was Shem. There's Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Here is Shem. Notice his timeline. Shem lived a long time, as often was the case of those early people. And notice Shem now, and follow his line, or follow the timeline straight up from Shem, and you'll see that Shem was still alive when Jacob was living. Now Jacob, remember, is the one who's about to bless his sons. Can you imagine? Jacob could talk to Shem, who was the son of Noah, and Noah would have talked to people who knew Adam. Just not very far removed because they lived such a long time. But now back to our story. I just thought that's interesting to me. Now notice Joseph. And again, remember where we are, about 1850 to 1875 BC. And right above that timeline would be Jacob. Now, Jacob's not going to live much longer than this, but this is the time frame that we're working with here. Jacob is going to tell things, as you notice now the next timeline, Jacob is going to tell things that are going to happen. Much of this is going to happen here in the between where they are in the days of Saul and David and Solomon. Really from Moses, who brings them out of Egypt, all the way to the kings. And this is all the time of the tribes as they are settling in the land of Canaan, and some events that happen after that. And really follow the timeline all the way over. And who do you see over here is Jesus. And that would be sort of the year zero as we count time, isn't it? And so from 1850 to 1875 BC to the time of Christ, it's just that, 1800 some odd years. And yet Jacob is here telling them what is going to happen between then, right then, and some 1800 plus years later. It's amazing. Now, back to these children. Remember, now he's calling his sons together to bless them, to tell them things that are going to come to pass in the last days. Now, Joseph, he was the 11th son according to age. Now, he was the oldest of Jacob's most beloved wife, Rachel. And so you wonder, now Joseph is really sort of getting ahead of some of the others, but Joseph has a very key role in this entire story, doesn't he? But also you think about the oldest, you think about Reuben. Now Reuben was the firstborn, but remember what he did? He committed incest with Bilhah, his father's wife, his father's concubine. In fact, in 1 Chronicles 5, verse 1, it tells us that it was Reuben's sin with Bilhah that kept him from receiving his birthright. See, Reuben should have received a double portion. But that honor goes to Joseph. And so Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, are going to be equal with all the sons of Jacob. It's like they're moved up a generation. And they're given that double honor. Actually, Joseph is given the double honor. And so when later in history, when you read about the 12 tribes of Israel, sometimes people make a big deal out of the lost tribe, the 13th tribe, and all of that. And what they failed, I think, sometimes to account for is that Joseph received a double honor. His two sons, Jacob said, those are mine. Jacob counted them as his. And then he said, now Joseph, the ones born after them, they'll be yours. But Ephraim and Manasseh are mine. And so that's what we find. Now, by birth order, Manasseh was the oldest of Joseph, but Jacob said, no, it's going to be Ephraim. And so that's going to be the greatest of the two. And so Joseph received this double portion. As we read mostly all of Genesis 48, it's about Jacob talking with Joseph and then Manasseh and Ephraim. And so Ephraim, the younger of Joseph's two children, is going to become a greater nation than his older brother Manasseh. And we find that to be the case. In the days of the divided kingdom, hundreds of years later, Ephraim's name, in fact, becomes synonymous with the name of Israel. Later in their history, the kingdom is going to divide. You're going to have the kingdom of Israel, or the northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom, or the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel, by and large, is wicked. And sometime, instead of saying Israel, it substitutes the name Ephraim, just really denoting what an influential tribe they're going to be. And so Ephraim was a predominant tribe, even during the conquest of Canaan. Our point from saying that is that it's just what Jacob said was going to happen. And Jacob only knew that because God revealed it to him. And so in chapter 49 now, he's going to start with the sons of Leah. Remember, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah will be the first four. Reuben, notice what he says about Reuben. His firstborn ought to be the place of honor. He says, no, he will not excel. He says, Reuben, you are my firstborn in verse 3, my might in the beginning of my strength. Notice verse 4, unstable as water, you shall not excel. Really, that unstable as water could be translated boiling over as water. Just referring to his uncontrollable desires and lusts which moved him to take Bilhah, his father's concubine, back in chapter 35 and verse 22. Well, as we look at history then, we see that the tribe of Reuben, as they take the promised land hundreds of years later, they're on the east of the Jordan. But they never come to any eminence in the Commonwealth of Israel. Now that was a quote from Albert Barnes' commentary on the Old Testament. Well, that was Reuben, the oldest. And then he comes to Simeon and Levi, the next two. And what does he say about them? How he said, instruments of cruelty in verse 5. Well, why would he say that? And he says they'll be scattered in Israel. Well, as we look at history, we see that. Well, why does he call them instruments of cruelty? Remember what they did to the village of Shechem? They had some of them, Shechem by name, the young prince, you might call him. He had seduced Dinah, their sister, and had committed fornication with her. Violated her, as they would say. And they would say such a thing ought not to be done. And they tricked the men, and they went in and they killed all the men of Shechem. And so it says they're instruments of cruelty, undoubtedly referring to that. Now, he said, you'll be scattered throughout Israel. Well, that's interesting then. You look at history. Were they scattered throughout Israel? What might that mean? Simeon's inheritance came within the tribe of Judah. See, they didn't have it's sort of like they didn't have near as big a piece of land. In fact, Judah had received their allotment, and they gave part of it to Simeon. And so if we look at a map here, notice on the bottom left of your screen there on the map, notice there's Judah, and right below the name Judah is Simeon. And so you see that Simeon was carved out of Judah. They didn't have such a distinguished territory as did the others. The others would join the other tribes, but they would not be locked in by any one tribe, as was Simeon. Well, we find then that Simeon just didn't multiply like the others. Just wasn't as large of a tribe. Later, some moved to Gedor, east of Israel, and others moved to Mount Seir toward Edom, and we find that in 1 Chronicles 4. And so they just sort of dispersed, and they just sort of became assimilated in with the others. So they were scattered. Well, what about Levi? Well, Levi's going to be scattered, but we're going to find that they really have a great place of honor. The Levites become what's known as the priestly tribe. When God gives the law to Moses, and it's then called the law of Moses, the Levites are selected to be the priest. Only Levites could serve in that role. But because of that, they were not given a separate portion of land. God said that He would be their inheritance. Now they received some cities and the pasture land around them, but the Levites themselves did not have a tract of land that says, on the map, Levi. that wasn't their role. They were all through Israel. They were given cities all through Israel. They were scattered through Israel, just as Jacob hundreds of years before had said. Now, then there's Judah. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, the fourth born of Leah. Well, there's some very wonderful things said about Judah. And you pick that up starting at verse 8 of chapter 49. Among the things said about Judah, it said rulers would come from him, including the Messiah. In fact, the way it words it is till Shiloh comes. The word Shiloh means peace. Who is Jesus, the Prince of Peace? And so Judah is given the great honor of being the tribe through whom our Savior will come. But also Judah it was foretold of Judah through Jacob that he would become one of the wealthiest. In fact, that happens. The way that it's worded here in our text is he'd have eyes red with wine and his teeth white from milk. Now he's not talking about drinking too much wine. He's talking about having so much of it and having so much in livestock where they would get their milk and so on. And he says in verse 8, your brothers will bow down before you. I can't help but chuckle a little bit at that. I wonder what they thought, because remember, when Joseph told them they'd bow down to him, they didn't like it at all. And now Judah is being told essentially something very similar anyway. Well, the family of David was from Judah. Remember David, the great king of all of Israel. And it's through David, in particular, that the lineage of Christ would flow through. And in verse 10 here in chapter 49 rather, of Genesis, it says, the scepter shall not depart from him. The scepter, that symbol of rule. And so the kingdom of Israel, the line of kings, especially as you follow it all the way through, the true line was of David. And through that, those descendants would come the Christ. Well, then you had also the sons of Leah. The next would be Zebulun. And Zebulun was told, you'll live by the sea. Well, some of these prophecies are a little bit harder to pinpoint their fulfillment than others. But what he says, though, of what we find in history is that they inherit the northern part of Israel. And they indirectly benefit from sea commerce of the Phoenicians that are their neighbors. Then there's Issachar. Of Issachar, it said, well, you'll become a band of slaves. Well, I'm just not sure how that might have been fulfilled. I know that it was, but I'm just not sure how. And then there's Dan. As we come to the sons of the handmaids, there's Dan. Well, Dan, it said of Dan, Jacob says, you shall judge your people. Well, the things that we can look at in history that might fit that would be maybe talking about Samson. Remember the story of Samson and Delilah? Samson had that great superhuman strength. He was from the tribe of Dan. And then he talks of Gad. Gad, another son of one of the handmaids. Why, Gad shall be trampled upon, but will triumph in the end. Well, as you look at Gad, how might that have been fulfilled? Well, their inheritance, when they get to the promised land, was in what's called the Transjordan. And that's on the east side of the river Jordan, but it's also the buffer between the land of Israel and those warring tribes like the Ammonites and the Edomites and so on. And so they had constant pressure, and yet from the enemies, and yet so often they triumphed. And so they'll be trampled upon, but will triumph in the end. Now here's a map to show some of this that we've been talking about. You see Gad now on the right side of the Jordan. Again, that's that buffer zone, you might say. There's Simeon, again, we looked at down on the bottom left, how he is landlocked. See Naphtali above the Sea of Galilee, and there's Dan above him. As you think about Asher now, let's go back to our sons now. Asher said his food shall be bountiful, and we find that he inherits land that is so fertile that just food is produced abundantly from Asher. Naphtali, we looked at it on the map just a minute ago, says uses beautiful words. Well, that's interesting because Isaiah would comfort them in the book of Isaiah, saying that a great light would shine there in the days of the Messiah. Well, we find that referred to in Matthew chapter 4. In fact, they inherit the territory closest to the Sea of Galilee, and that's where Jesus will spend most of his time. What a wonderful thing it is to say they're known for beautiful words, and there Jesus spends so much time in their territory, as you can see on the map, around the Sea of Galilee. And then there's Joseph. Joseph is the distinguished one among all of his brethren because of his steadfast trust in God. And although he was so richly blessed, and given a double portion, yet it's not his tribe, neither one of his sons would be the one through whom Jesus would come. As we said, it would be Judah. And then only one verse is given to Benjamin, but it says, oh, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, adept at warfare. And sure enough, that's what we find about Benjamin. In fact, one time, Benjamin just takes on all the other tribes. Not in a right way, but he's willing to fight all the rest of them. He's so sure of the skill as a warrior. And so we find that all these things that Jacob is saying are going to come to pass. And what do we see? Everything God says will happen. And that's the point I want you to remember from this lesson. It's more than a history lesson. It's to say when God says it, we can count on it. Now, next time, we're going to finish up our study of Genesis. I encourage you to go ahead and order the next book. In fact, This is the book. I encourage you to order it. It's free of charge. The information will be on your screen from time to time. Thank you for being with us, and look forward to our next study together.
Walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky.